Shortly after the supposed death of the former king, rumors started to spread that he might have survived. For example, his half-brother Edmund of Woodstock, the Earl of Kent, attended Edward's funeral in December 1327 and was accompanied by several followers, but the men are said to have been convinced that the former monarch was still alive. Edmund of Woodstock was so obsessed with this idea that 3 years later he tried to free his brother from Corfe Castle, where he was said to have been held captive. This cost him his life. Regent Roger Mortimer had him executed after a show trial and overruled King Edward III, who wanted to pardon his uncle. The young king himself made sure as well that the rumors did not fall silent. It was not until after the removal of Mortimer in October 1330 that he spoke of the murder of his father. Until then, he at least publicly supported the explanation that Edward II had died of natural causes. Of the 8 people who were eventually accused of murdering his father and uncle, Edward executed only 2, Mortimer and his henchman Simon Bereford. Among the men who managed to escape or were immediately pardoned was Thomas de Berkeley. He was not only a son-in-law of Mortimer, but also one of the jailers of Edward II. Carried out his task together with John Maltravers, who, contrary to what has been often reported, was never found guilty of the murder of the former king. The 2 men were paid £5 a day to care for Edward II. Records show several luxurious purchases made by the men, raising doubts about how good the former monarch's living conditions really were. Some chroniclers report on harsh prison conditions. De Berkeley later tried to clear himself of the guilt that he had something to do with the king's death, since he had not even been there on September 21st, but he was on his own estates. Edward III knew this was a lie. It was, after all, none other than Thomas de Berkeley who had informed him that his father had died. The news reached him as early as September 23rd, only about a day after the reported death. This would have been far too little time for de Berkeley to receive news himself on his estate and report to the young king. Edward, however, did not object. Parliament acquitted de Berkeley. In 1331, Edward even paid him back a sum still owed by his father. Apart from the 2 executed, almost all of the accused were able to return to England at some point. They were to live for decades to come. Some of them even had a career under Edward III. The monarch may have been convinced by now that his father hadn't actually died, and he possibly even met him. Several steps are said to have been necessary for this development. First, the king had never actually seen his father's body. Only a few local political figures were allowed to see the dead monarch at Corfe Castle. The body was then sewed in a body bag and taken to Gloucester Cathedral, which it reached on October 21st, 1327. Here the body was placed in a coffin made of lead, which was eventually surrounded by another coffin made of wood. An opening of the tomb in 1855 showed that both coffins still existed in a really good condition. If Edward II survived, the question arises as to who was hewn into the body bag. The so-called Fishy letter, which reached the young king in 1337, provided an answer. The monk, Manuel Fishy, reported in the letter that his father escaped with the help of a servant and lived as a hermit in the Holy Roman Empire. Historians consider the letter itself to be authentic. We will deal with the content later. I show the letter in the original Latin and in the English translation here. In keeping with the letter, a legend was transmitted over the centuries that an English king was buried in the monastery of the Italian municipality of Sesima. The king is said to be Edward II. It is not clear when, according to this assumption, he actually died. But it must have been after 1338, because it was in that year that he supposedly met his son Edward III. The meeting is said to have taken place in the German city of Koblenz. The English king was here because he was appointed imperial vicar of the Holy Roman Empire. Edward had a long private conversation with a man called William le Gallais or William the Welsh, who is said to have been his father. What happened to him afterwards is hidden from us in history. One theory, however, is that the man may also have been known as William Oakley. This is very interesting, as William Oakley was one of the alleged murderers of Edward II. The man, who had been part of Mortimer's retinue for some years, fled in October 1330 and was never seen again. It is reasonable to think that Edward II had taken the place of the real Oakley and left England in 1330. However, this raises the question of what became of the real William Oakley. This leads us back to the body that was brought to Gloucester Cathedral as Edward II. Perhaps this was the real Oakley. The official letter, however, contradicts this. Here it is said that it was a porter who was killed during the liberation of Edward II. One historian who assumes with certainty that Edward survived is Ian Mortimer, who presents his reflections in this regard in his biography of Roger Mortimer. Those men are not related. The explanations are in the part of the book called Chapter 12 Revisited. Ian Mortimer took the trouble to structure all relevant chronicle reports not only temporarily, but also spatially. In this way, he was able to show that the legendary story of Edward's murder by means of a hot poker did not emerge until years after his death, and the first chronicler who could have reported about it was at least 90 miles away. It only became widely used decades later thanks to the monk Ranulph Acton. We owe Ian Mortimer a version of Edward II's life after his supposed death. Edward was brought from Kenilworth Castle to Berkeley Castle, but was moved several times in the spring and summer of 1327 because of repeated attempts to free him. It was not until the late summer of 1327 that he finally returned to Berkeley Castle for good. It was during this time that he is said to have written this poem. Whether it actually goes back to Edward, however, is disputed in research. The attempts at liberation are said to have been quite promising. In one case, the liberators allegedly even got as far as the prison at Berkeley Castle, where Edward was not located. Roger Mortimer was supposedly fine with this. He feared that he would no longer be able to control Edward III after he came of age. He therefore wanted to keep Edward II as a bargaining chip. If Edward really doesn't allow himself to be controlled, he could still bring back his father on the throne. According to Ian Mortimer, Isabella was not privy to the plan. However, she and her son Edward are said to have been informed shortly after the feigned death that Edward II was safe and sound in his new prison, Corfe Castle. The plan seems to have worked. Not only did Edward III never object to his father's death, but he even planned his funeral, which cost the hefty sum of £351. The tomb quickly became a magnet for wealthy visitors. Ian Mortimer assumes that Edward III had his father buried in secret in the tomb in Gloucester Cathedral as soon as he had actually died. On the continent, Edward is said to have been received by various high-ranking people before he finally began his life as a hermit. Apart from the alleged meeting with Edward III, his further career is only a source for historical novels, but not for historians. There's far too little to work with. However, this theory has some holes, quite large ones to be real. There is conflicting information about where Edward II was between 1327 and 1330. The official letter says that he was already a hermit by then. Edmund of Woodstock apparently still thought he was in England in March 1330. If the theory of an exchange of places with William Oakley is correct, he was even in England until October 1330. Fischli also had a vested interest in Edward III believing the story that his father was still alive. He hoped for patronage from the English king. But if the story is made up, where do all the details in the letter come from? Also, who was William the Welsh? And why was Edward III so gentle with his father's alleged murderers? So much is unclear when it comes to the death of Edward II. The generations that came directly after him also had to struggle with this. The chronicler Geoffrey Leigh Baker, for example, made Edward a tortured martyr. King Richard II, great-grandson of the king, tried in vain to have him canonized in 1395. My point of view is this: it is unlikely that Edward II survived. He must have continued to be in captivity afterwards, otherwise he would probably have tried to return to the throne at some point. Isabella and Mortimer managed to quickly become as unpopular as he and Hewlett Spencer were. The latter, however, was blamed for this, and he was executed for a long time by then. The example of Edmund of Woodstock and the numerous attempts at liberation already show that Edward would have found support for his return to power. If he was still in captivity, Mortimer was the only person to be considered responsible. But the two men hated each other with a passion. The idea that the old king could serve as a bargaining chip to control the young monarch therefore seems highly doubtful. Let's not sugarcoat it. The idea is pretty crazy, especially since Edward III finally rebelled against his power-hungry regent and got rid of him. So where was the exchange of kings then? It is more plausible that Edward II actually died. This, however, leaves open the questions of whom Edward III met in Koblenz and why he was so lenient with the murderers. This is another example for the beauty and the ugly of doing history. We will probably never get a conclusive answer, but it's so much fun to search for one. Thanks for watching, please like and subscribe. Bye!